Welcome everyone to our next presentation in the Ability 360 Move United series. My name is Chris Perry and I'm a consultant with Ability 360 working with the wheelchair basketball team, bringing you some of the best that we can offer you in exercise science, fitness, and all health related topics in our hashtag Adapt to Home series. So welcome to today. Today's presentation is all about aerobic and anaerobic conditioning for athletes. Throughout our series so far, we've talked about all topics, including sleep, program design, strength training for kids. If you're interested in any of those topics, please be sure to visit our YouTube page at Ability 360. All right, so without further ado, let's talk a little bit about aerobic and anaerobic conditioning, which is before we do so, let me briefly introduce myself for those of you who may not know me or have not yet watched any of our lecture episodes so far. My name is Christopher Perry. I am currently a full-time faculty member at Brown University, where I teach fitness and exercise science courses and run our mentorship program. Further, I'm also a research associate at Arizona State, where I'm finishing up my doctorate, where I also study sleep science and strength and conditioning as well. I've been a strength and conditioning coach for over 13 years, and I've been working with Ability 360 this past year with their adapted sports. So tonight's topics, we're focusing on the original topic for this lecture was supposed to be all about anaerobic conditioning, but I decided to make some small additions with aerobic conditioning as well, because when we work with athletes, we do all sorts of types of training and oftentimes we introduce both aerobic and anaerobic training into our programs for our athletes to give them the best chance that they have for performing their absolute best. And we've also seen that the most well-rounded athletes are able to perform the best are ones that have both adaptations from aerobic and anaerobic training. So I'm going to do my best to go through each of them and how it applies to working with athletes of all ages. Is not only going to impact how we work with athletes of a younger age at Ability 360, but also our adult athletes as well. So first, I'd like to define what these two things are. And the reason there's a big difference between anaerobic and aerobic training is simply how our metabolism works. When it comes to our metabolism and our metabolic processes, metabolism is basically a magic word to define all the processes it takes to break down food into energy in our body. And oftentimes that's either done with or without oxygen. So when it comes to anaerobic training, anaerobic means without oxygen. So the metabolic processes it takes to give us energy, these specific ones don't require oxygen. Now, as a result of that, we're able to produce more energy. We're able to produce more power, more strength. These are more of our exercises that are short bursts of energy, but of high intensity. All right, we're able to move those weights. We're able to sprint. We're able to change directions really quickly. We're able to participate in interval training. Okay, the only way that I can do that is if I get energy from the anaerobic energy system. Therefore, we call it anaerobic training. So the way that I improve my anaerobic training abilities is to continue to do higher intensity exercise, lasting no more than anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes of total activity. So if you need an example exercises to this, you could put it with short bouts on the basketball court. You could say football is an anaerobic energy sport. You could say this quick bursts in swimming, the non-long distance versions. You could say anything like such as CrossFit or weightlifting style of exercises are going to be under that anaerobic window. On the other hand, when it comes to aerobic exercise, this means with oxygen. These are the metabolic processes that require oxygen to break substrates down. So this is going to be more for my slower steady state processes, my slower types of exercise. You're going to see this is more long steady state duration, such as being a marathon runner or cross country or some sort of triathlete, anything that requires you to be physically active for longer than 2 minutes. And more often when we define an aerobic athlete, we define more of someone who is that long distance cardiovascular type of athlete. Now, what are the factors that are actually related to my overall endurance? So there's a lot of things I need to think of as a coach or as a trainer who's working with athletes. First, I need to make sure that I'm aware of maximal aerobic capacity, which is basically my maximal capability of how long I can push myself, at what intensity I can push myself, and I can get improvements with that with certain types of aerobic training, either through adaptations in the mitochondria within our muscle. As we know, when we push ourselves longer and harder, such as doing our cardiovascular training regularly, I improve by increasing the strength of my cardiovascular system, which also sends a signal to my body to increase what's called mitochondria. We're going to talk about these later in the presentation today, which allow me to consume more oxygen. And if my body can consume more oxygen, then I can push myself for longer periods of time. It increases my endurance. I also need to be aware of my lactate threshold, which is also really indicative of my anaerobic training performance. So my lactate threshold is the time it takes for me doing activity before the onset of lactate starts to occur in the blood. And the more lactate you have in the blood, eventually it'll cause a differential in the acidity of your blood, which will negate the process of anaerobic metabolism. So if I were to put that into easier words for you to understand, what that means is as my blood starts to accrue lactate, it interferes with the processes taking place that are giving me energy. So it's going to start slowing me down. You can allude this to where you get the burning sensation in your legs or in certain muscle groups when you're doing strength training or you're doing sprints. Or if you're running, you can start to feel it at the point to where you literally feel the burning sensation in your legs. You're starting to slow down, you're starting to fatigue. That is due to the buildup of lactate that is causing the buildup of hydrogen ions that cause your blood to become more acidic, that starts to shut those processes down. So the more that I exercise and the more that I do anaerobic type of exercise, knowing an athlete's lactate threshold is important because that gives me a note of reference of how to program how I'm doing my conditioning work with my team of athletes or with my client that I'm working with. So that every time I come back to do those workouts, I know exactly how hard I need to push them and for how long so that they will eventually adapt and that lactate threshold will start to go higher. And therefore that will improve their performance and then they can start working harder for longer periods of time. And then I also need to be aware of my exercise economy because the better aerobic endurance I have, the better my body is able to perform the same amount of work at less cost to the body. So for instance, and this is all due to improving your overall VO2 max and your lactate threshold. So if I were to put this into easier words to understand, if I have an improved exercise economy, well, let's say I started at baseline at week 0 that I just started training and my exercise economy was very low. I had very, very low endurance. But as a program goes on, let's say 4, 6, 8 weeks or so, my aerobic endurance increases by a lot. My maximal aerobic capacity goes up by my VO2 max, and my lactate threshold improves. This makes it easier for my body to do the same amount of work at less cost to the body, so that it's not as much, not only is it not much wear and tear, but it also doesn't cost as much energy. So it makes it much easier for my body to maintain higher levels of intensity at longer periods of time, thus improving my performance. So first, let's talk about the nitty gritty. Okay, I want to start with a little bit of the science on how it actually happens under the hood. If I were to lift up the car hood of how your body responds to exercise, we need to understand the inner workings that are occurring to allow this growth to happen. Okay, it doesn't just happen like the snap of my fingers, Harry Potter waving a wand. There's actual changes going on within your muscle tissue, within your heart, within your blood, and the way your metabolic system works that allows our body to improve its performance. And the first one is your brain, your neural adaptation. So when I do specifically anaerobic style training, and under this hood, I can put certain types of circuit strength training or resistance training itself. I can put sprint training, anything that falls within that 30-second to 2-minute window of higher intensity exercise, something that's a lot harder than simply jogging at a nice and easy pace. And one of the first responses of the body that's going to happen is as you start to train, you'll start to have these neural adaptations. So this is what we can also astute to why it is that when you first start strength training for the first time, how you get strong really, really fast within the first few weeks of training. This is simply due to the, okay, if you don't use it, you lose it. So your body hasn't been using it. And so once you first start doing strength training, you create those neural adaptation. Your brain is now making the neural connections to the muscle tissue and you're basically now using more of what you have more efficiently. So now your brain can fire off a neural impulse when you lift a weight, and now it can activate more muscle tissue of what you already have to overcome the load or the weight that you're trying to lift, okay? Also, the way that neural adaptations can work is with certain types of exercises. So your body hasn't moved in a certain way before. So let's say I'm doing a squat or a deadlift or a bench press. My body has never done those exercises before. And so as I continue to do those exercises and I have a good coach who's teaching me how to do the techniques in a very efficient way, my body will start to develop an adherence to those motor patterns and thus can start to be better at moving those motor patterns. And then my body gets better at recruiting muscle tissue in a synchronized fashion So then it can utilize the muscle groups that are used in certain exercises much more efficiently. Further, it can adapt in the way that the motor units work. A motor unit is a set of neurons that attach to a group of muscle tissue. And the more enhanced I am with my neural adaptation, the overall more muscle fibers I can activate. So if you were to compare a beginner or a newbie strength trainer versus someone who's been strength training for years, you would see that there's a difference between the total amount of muscle tissue that an advanced lifter is actually able to recruit compared to someone who's just starting out. That's all from that neural adaptation. So the individual who's been lifting longer can activate more of his muscle tissue. He can activate more of the larger muscle fibers. We'll get into this soon, right? There's a difference between a slow twitch and a fast twitch muscle fiber. So he can recruit more of the powerful, more of the explosive muscle fibers within his muscle belly. He can also, he or she, I'm sorry, can also increase the rate of firing. So he can increase the speed of which he's contracting his muscles. He can also increase their synchronization of which they fire. And then it can also result in a combination of all of these, which as a result can increase the speed, increase the power, and increase the total amount of force that I can produce when doing these exercises or when lifting these weights. It all starts in the brain. So when I show you this picture, this shows you all about recruitment of muscle fibers. So the way that our muscle fibers are recruited within a muscle tissue, and this is with any muscle in your body, there's an order effect, okay? Because there's a particular threshold. Your body is not going to activate what it has unless it has to, right? Your body is a very efficient machine. So when I do resistance or anaerobic training, okay, where the weight is usually heavier than what I can typically use, then it's going to pass the threshold by which my body says, okay, we need to use the higher threshold motor units. We need to use more of the type 2 muscle fibers. So as a result, the more force that my body has to produce, the more likely I am to first go up the ladder and activate the low, but then get to the higher threshold motor units and activate the type 2 motor units. But now the only way to do that though is I have to become an experienced lifter. I have to start lifting more often. I have to lift heavier weights to be able to achieve this adaptation, to be able to do that. And over time, the more advanced I become in a strength or anaerobic training program, my body can actually get better at going right to it. And it actually has a better potential to activate the type 2 muscle fibers much more quickly to get the desired output that I need to be able to overcome whatever load that I'm working with. So if I were to apply this to working with athletes, when I'm a strength and conditioning coach, or when I'm, let's say, just a normal coach who's trying to implement a strength training program or an anaerobic training program, then when they first start out, they might not be able to have this level of adaptation. Their endurance might be low. They might not have as much forced production output. But throughout the course of the training program, as they begin to adapt and get better and better and better, as they approach 4 to 6 to sometimes 8 weeks of training, you'll see drastic, significant improvements to where then the athletes are able to be much more explosive, much more powerful, and therefore will apply to their increased performance in whatever field of play that they're in. So this is why it's also important to organize programming appropriately to the end of today's presentation. Let's talk about reflexes, because reflexes are something that happens as well when it comes to neuromuscular reflexes. So a reflex response is going to enhance the magnitude and rate of my force development. So just like when the doc, when you were kids, took his device, the little rubber tip at the end, and touched it right to the end of your talon of the patellar tendon, and how your leg, your quadriceps muscle contracted and your lower limb popped up. Okay, that's a particular reflex. Something similar happens with all muscle groups in your body. And we can relate this to autogenic inhibition, which allows a particular muscle to act in a response to tension. As you continue to train, especially with anaerobic training, where you're trying to be explosive, you're trying to be powerful, you can actually increase this response. And it allows you to develop more power when you're being explosive with all the movements that you're enhancing. So this is just another one of those neuromuscular adaptations that can take place if you're an athlete who's going through regular anaerobic or resistance training. Now let's talk about the actual muscular adaptations, right? Because everyone wants to talk about muscle, okay? And these ones are easy. And we've talked about these before in previous presentations when we talked about strength training for youth athletes. Very simple. When you have a continuously progressive strength training program, or even anaerobic training, depending upon what style you're doing, because you can see this in things like CrossFit as well, which would count as anaerobic training that includes circuits using various levels of weights. Skeletal muscle adapts by the first and foremost by increasing size. As I increase the volume of training, whether it's the amount of weight that I'm lifting, the total number of sets, or even if I'm doing anaerobic style sprints that are of higher intensity, I'm going to get some increase in muscle size, right? Because I'm breaking down muscle tissue, and its first reaction is to rebuild by adding proteins and making it larger. The next way is by facilitating fiber type transitions. So to keep it simple, because if I were to put you through a molecular muscle physiology class, you would find out that there's many fiber types along the spectrum. But for the course of this and what I teach my basic exercise physiology students, we're going to keep it to just two types. Okay, type 1 and type 2. Just know that there is a spectrum in between. All right, and the important takeaway to this is we have to introduce the law of specificity, which states whatever specific style of training that you're undergoing, your body is going to adapt to that specific type of thing. Your body is going to get better at that specific type of exercise. So one of these adaptations that occurs in muscle tissue is the way that my fiber types will transition. So if I behave more like a weightlifter who's doing a lot of weightlifting and prioritizing resistance training in my physical activity routines, then certain fibers within my muscle tissue are going to start behaving more like type 2 muscle fibers, which are meant to be stronger, faster, more explosive, can produce more force. Whereas on the flip side, if I start doing marathon runs and I do nothing but steady state cardio and running throughout the neighborhood and doing nothing but cardiovascular exercise at long durations, then my body's muscle fibers are going to transition to become more slow twitch muscle fibers, which are more oxidative. They utilize oxygen much more. They're more fatigue resistant than their type 2 counterparts. They can last a lot longer. They're meant for endurance. The body can transition based off of whatever type of activity you're primarily doing. If you're doing a variety of exercises, then you'll get an equal split in certain ways. This can also be based off of your genetics as well. Some people are just genetically gifted to be more type 2 or more type 1. If you were to take a muscle biopsy of elite athletes in whatever specific type of sport they're in, guarantee that if you were to look at their muscle tissue at a microscopic level, you would find that compared to a normal general individual, they have a significantly higher amount of whatever specific muscle fiber that gives them the edge in their sport. All right? So genetics has a lot to play with, come into play with when it comes to overall performance. Muscle adaptations can also be enhanced by the biomechanical and structural components of the cells. So for instance, if I'm a marathon runner, or if I'm someone who does a lot of cardiovascular training, then I'm going to see something called increased mitochondrial density. And we're going to talk about the mitochondria soon. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, which builds and emits ATP, okay? It helps produce ATP for the body, which is just your energy currency. The more mitochondria that I have, the ultimately more endurance I have. So the more type of activity that I do, the more chemical components I'm going to have inside of my muscles that are in charge of doing those metabolic processes that gives me energy. Or on the flip side, if I'm more into strength training, I'm going to have more of the enzymes and chemical components that are going to allow me to be more efficient at performing strength training exercise. So once again, that law of specificity. And all of this results in enhanced muscular strength, power, or endurance, depending upon what types of activities I'm doing. So this just highlights it on a much more detailed level for any of my coaches who might have been in attendance today and wanted to see more upon how it is that muscle adaptations actually take place. And we can make these available for our coaches at will. So let's talk about a little bit about that mitochondria because it's very, very important. And I actually really enjoyed when I found this picture to put in here with the car with the mitochondria. See, because if you were to just look at the mitochondria in the bottom right picture here, a lot of people would look at that and be like, I don't understand what that means. It says DNA, ribosomes, granules. I'm not sure what that is. Whereas if I were to actually show you the picture of the car, then that would make a lot more sense. The The mitochondria is the powerhouse of your cell. It is one of the major components that has correlations with overall health and well-being, overall endurance and energy throughout the day. Mitochondria is very, very important and has implications for how we can perform on a daily basis, whether it is just the quality of our life or doing physical activity. So once again, just to illustrate, your mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's where metabolic processes take place that require oxygen, and they give off ATP. When I do cardiovascular style exercise, it sends a signal to my body to make more of these guys. And the more mitochondria I have, the more ATP I can ultimately produce, the more energy I can ultimately have. So it's very, very beneficial to have higher mitochondrial densities. If you do strength training will send a different signal to the body that will focus on building more muscle tissue and building strength. It will not focus on mitochondrial density, which is why as a fitness professional, coming as a strength and conditioning coach, we always advise that strength and conditioning coaches have a variety of training methods. Don't ever do just strength training alone or just cardiovascular training alone. There is something to say about having an ultimate balance, but knowing how to balance them appropriately, which we're going to talk about here close to the end of the presentation. So if you're a potential coach or trainer who's interested on how to combine both resistance and aerobic training effectively without one or the other harming the progress of the other, it's very important to pay attention all the way to the end, because this is something that a lot of coaches ask questions about and really need to do well to improve the overall performance of their athletes. And this is where we get into the compatibility of aerobic and anaerobic modes of training. If we were to look at it on a spreadsheet and show, okay, what happens when let's say our primary goals are strength training, but we introduce a plethora of aerobic training. So if I were to have I'm going to use wheelchair basketball as an example. If I were to have a wheelchair basketball team who focuses on building strength, okay, if they were to focus only on building strength, but they also concentrated on doing very, very long aerobic style workouts, then the high amounts of aerobic workouts throughout the week would ultimately negatively impact the way that an athlete who is trying to build strength or muscle in a negative way, because there are differing signals in the body. Whereas oftentimes, if it's the other way around, if I have aerobic athletes who do just strength training 2 or 3 times per week, it can actually have a positive benefit. But what if I change the mode of cardiovascular training for strength trainers? Because if strength training is so important for my athletes to not only be able to produce force out on the court, be explosive, be able to change direction, okay? They also need endurance. They need to be able to withstand fatigue as long as possible throughout the entire length of the game. So how do they do that? How do they do cardiovascular training without limiting the progress they make in developing strength, power, speed? And that's where we get into how we do concurrent training. So first off, let's look at the overall benefits that we see from doing anaerobic versus aerobic training, and then we'll get into how we can mix and match them appropriately. So the first thing, when it comes to performance enhancements from anaerobic exercise, and remember, this is any exercise that's within 30 seconds to 2 minutes of activity, I see increase in power. Remember, power is the speed of which I can develop force. Okay, so speed and force together. Okay, whereas strength is just the total amount of internal intention that I can create within a muscle group to overcome a load. So strength is how much weight can I lift? Power is how fast I can produce that power, that force. So, and when it comes to working in athletics, power is the most important thing, but strength can for sure enhance it. I also have improvements in local muscular endurance, which is going to improve my oxidative and buffering capacity. So if I have athletes who are used to doing anaerobic style exercise, where we're doing nothing but focusing on short sprints, or such as suicide runs, tempo runs, interval training, it's going to improve my ability to buffer out the increase of the acidity in the blood, right? Because remember what I said earlier when we're talking about the lactate threshold and how the buildup of lactate in the blood will cause an increase of hydrogen ions that are eventually going to negate the processes of metabolism. By doing more and more anaerobic exercise, I continue to push that limit. I continue to push the lactate threshold higher and higher, and thus I can have a higher buffering capacity, which in English means I have more endurance. I can push myself harder for longer at those higher intensities. Another positive benefit, especially in today's society, is improved body composition. Because when I do anaerobic exercise, not only do I burn more calories from it being a higher intensity amount of work, but I also create more of a oxygen debt, okay, which we call the, oh goodness. And when I talk about the oxygen debt, I talk about that afterburn effect, okay? And this is very popular in fitness trends nowadays, which we have to be careful. So what an oxygen debt is when I'm performing higher intensity exercise, I am doing enough exercise that requires enough oxygen and allow me to produce enough energy to be able to perform that exercise. But it's happening so fast, I'm producing more carbon dioxide than I am taking in oxygen, and that creates an oxygen debt. And so that pushes me out of homeostasis. And what the body has to do is a process called excess post-oxygen consumption. So it creates an EPOC. At the end of exercise, my body has to upregulate my metabolic rate in order to allow my body to get back to normal. I have to make sure that I get enough oxygen in after exercise to be able to offset that whole bunch of carbon dioxide that my body just built up. And as a result, I burn more calories than natural. Now, this is where industries like the fitness industry, companies like Orange Theory, got the notion that high intensity interval training or anaerobic exercise burns a lot more calories after exercise. And because of that, they started to advertise that their programs could burn hundreds of calories after the exercise just by doing HIIT. They blew that way out of proportion. it is not a crazy amount of calories. Yes, it is beneficial. It will burn on average an extra 25 to 50 calories total after the exercise over the course of 24 hours. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's not really a lot. It is in the grand scheme of things, because if you have, in comparison to doing other work or other types of physical anaerobic activity, say 3 or 4 times per week, then you're ultimately expending anywhere from an extra 200 to sometimes 500 calories a week. And when it comes to keeping a healthy diet and needing enough calories to facilitate high performance, and when it comes to athletes do need to eat quite a bit of food, then this can help offset any unnecessary fat gain and can help improve my overall body composition. So anaerobic activity is very beneficial for improving my levels of fat-free mass and keeping fat mass low. Anaerobic training has also been found to be really beneficial for flexibility, which is something that usually goes unnoted. A lot of people think you need to do nothing but stretch to improve your flexibility. This is false. Actually, when you are under load in functional weight training movements to a high degree of, and you have proper mobility and you're able to get through a full range of motion, this is actually much more beneficial in improving your flexibility compared to any other rudimentary effort, because your body gets used to being at a certain range of motion under that load, and thus it allows your body to particular adaptations that allows you to be in those deeper ranges of motion. So when it comes to increasing our flexibility, oftentimes the reason why a lot of us aren't flexible enough or have chronic pain is simply the fact that our body is not used to moving in particular directions. When I do regular anaerobic exercise that allows me to push my body into these full ranges of motion from particular functional exercises, it allows me to not only build and improve, but maintain an optimal level of flexibility. What about my aerobic capacity? Okay, and we talked about aerobic capacity a little bit earlier, where aerobic capacity is my total amount of ability to consume oxygen. It's the total amount of ability that I'm able to push myself for how long and at what intensity. Okay, so basically, how hard can I push my aerobic system? All right, how long can I go for? How much oxygen can I consume? What is my VO2 max? What is my resting heart rate? What is my exercise training heart rate? All of that. And when it comes to what heavy lifting can do, okay, heavy lifting hasn't been found to actually increase my VO2 max, which is why we find if we were to look at all of the research that's been compiled and we were to look at the effects of cardiovascular training on your overall health, we would find that the higher your VO2 max, the higher resiliency you would have towards all causes of death. So typically, the more active you are through cardiovascular training throughout the course of your life, the higher resiliency you have towards cancers, metabolic disease, which includes diabetes, overweight or obesity, most heart diseases, including cardiovascular, coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, okay? Many different types of neurological diseases later on in life, even Alzheimer's. The higher your VO2 max, the higher resiliency you have towards all causes of death. Does that mean weight training doesn't have a place? No, not at all. Weight training is also very important. Weight training has been found to increase your aerobic capacity by increasing the overall structural capacity of your heart. Now, we know that ventricular increase in size of the ventricles from cardiovascular training is much more beneficial than what strength training actually does in increasing the thickness of the heart, which you don't want a heart that's too thick. Now, when it comes to untrained people, we do know that anaerobic activity can help improve individuals who are completely untrained. So simple circuit training a few times a week has been found to be beneficial in helping individuals who are completely out of shape or just simply haven't been exercising. Now, what we have found though is high volume anaerobic training can for sure have vast improvements on VO2 max and my overall aerobic capacity. And a simple way to apply that would be, say, doing 3 or 4 times a week of various forms of anaerobic activity, such as interval training or high intensity interval training. So without as much impact on my ability to adapt to, voila, strength training or some other types of power or resistance training. So this gives us an implication of how we might be able to structure a program for our anaerobic athletes and allow them to get the best of both worlds, both strength and power with endurance. I also get improvements from a motor performance. So logically, as we talked about earlier, not only do I get improvements in my cardiovascular function from anaerobic exercise, but also my overall motor performance and my ability to handle my body throughout space, my ability to develop speed and agility, all become improved the more I practice my sport-specific movements through anaerobic exercise. Now, something we definitely have to talk about when it comes to anaerobic training specifically, and we touched a little bit on this when we talk about sleep in a previous presentation, but anaerobic training especially. So let me reiterate: anaerobic training is without oxygen, and it's for higher intensity levels of activity. Anything that has a higher intensity is going to have more of a drastic impact on the body. It's going to have more wear and tear. It's going to have more of an impact on your endocrine system and your stress hormones. If coaches are not aware of how they're implementing anaerobic or higher intensity work into their programmings with their athletes, then they might be doing a disservice to their athletes by not knowing when to give them proper amounts of recovery or when to properly allow them to taper off training to allow recovery to take place. Because if you do too much anaerobic training, if you manipulate intensity way too quickly without your athletes either acclimating to the program or you raise the total duration or total volume of work way too high too fast, you could push an athlete into overtraining, which once an athlete is in overtraining, it takes a very long time for them to properly recover and work themselves out of it. So how to know the signs when you're a coach. And I can tell you this, if you're going off of the sign that it's a decrement in performance, if you're seeing that your young athletes or your adult athletes are starting to have decrements in performance, they're starting to not perform as well. They're sluggish. They're not looking as quick. They're not exploding off the ball as well. They're not shooting as well. Their agility and motor unit capabilities are going to be way off. Their accuracy levels, let's say if I'm working with a basketball athlete, everything is going to start dropping down in performance. If that is what you're using to measure overtraining, you're already too late. Okay, you're already too late. Overtraining has already set in. You have to start looking at what's going on with the body. Where's the resting heart rate? If the resting heart rate is elevated more than it should be, okay, and this is why it's important to track your athlete's heart rates often, which we're going to show you how, okay, then that can also be a sign of higher stress. If they're having difficulty sleeping, if they lose their appetite, psychological effects are very important here. They have a decreased desire to train or a decreased joy from training. They may look really, really lethargic, have a very high level of fatigue, maybe a little bit more irritable. If you're working with younger athletes, less likely to comply, which can all be indicative of sympathetic overtraining syndrome. So we must be very, very careful when this is why programming is so important, to pay attention to when we're upping intensity of work, how much work, including how many reps and the duration of activity we're applying here, and the overall frequency of training. Things we all need to take account when we're working with athletes, youth or adult. So let's get into it. How do we design a training program when it comes to conditioning? So throughout our Move You series here with Ability 360, with our with our hashtag Adapt at Home, we've talked about various levels of programming. We've talked about programming strength training for athletes. We've talked about sleep and recovery methods. Now let's talk about how to design a program implementing conditioning, utilizing both aerobic and anaerobic styles of training. Because as we know, both are very, very important to allow my athlete to have the most well-rounded approach to performance when they hit the court, field, or wherever their field of play is. So the first thing I want to start with is exercise mode. So what type of training? I need to be aware of what sport I'm working with specifically. What types of aerobics are going to apply to them? Whatever type of sport that you're working with, you want to make sure you pick activities that are specifically applicable to the sport, because that's going to allow them to not only develop the aerobic capacity that they need to perform, but also be able to adapt to the actual motor patterns they're going to be using during that sport. So for instance, if I'm working with wheelchair basketball athletes, I want to make sure that I'm designing my conditioning drills to be on the basketball court. It would make absolutely no sense for me to do them outside of that or on a track or anything like that. I'm going to make sure that they're going to be in the environment to where they're actually going to perform in that sport. That's going to enhance their motor capabilities and their motor adaptation and the neural adaptations to the actual sport. So they need to be specific activity dependent and need to be able to apply to the sport somehow. This is why the most common conditioning drill for basketball, I was once a strength and conditioning coach for basketball many years ago, was some sort of anaerobic drills with gassers or some sort of tempo ones that were designed to be on the basketball court themselves, that were also applicable during plays, that they actually found a way to enhance their play structure by incorporating anaerobic training into the actual running of their plays as well. So we had a two-pronged attack. It was much more applicable to the sport and how it could apply to game time. Next step, I need to be wary of training frequency. How often do I want to do the actual conditioning work? Because I need to be very aware. And a lot of anaerobic sports themselves, when they're engaged in practices, their practices are going to incur and have many of these elements. So I need to be very, very aware of what I'm doing in each and every practice. Most middle school, high school, and adult league sports have practice very often throughout the week. I know for a fact high school sports have practice every single day during the week, 5 days a week, and games on the weekends. So coaches need to be aware of how hard they're hitting the court every single day of the week and keeping track of the overall intensity and duration. It would be foolish for a coach not to keep track of how intense the conditioning work is on a day-to-day basis. And it would be way too much on an athlete to do hard anaerobic work every single day of the week. You need to be very, very careful when it comes to how you're manipulating intensity of work throughout the times. So one recommendation that I would make if I was to make this applicable here would be in every other day fashion, have some sort of anaerobic training. And on the days that you're not doing anaerobic training, focus on one other area of exercise, such as strength training, or a lighter aerobic style of work to be able to work on your aerobic adaptations in that way. It would also depend upon the time of year or the season that the athlete is in as well, which we'll get into close to the end. Part 3, training intensity, okay? And this has to be, excuse me, this has to be adaptation specific. So what are the needs of your particular athletes? Do they need to be stronger? Do I need to increase my endurance? All of this is going to depend, it's going to dictate how you level out the intensity of work that you give your athletes to do. So for instance, if I'm trying to improve my anaerobic endurance of my athletes, then I'm going to put a high focus on utilizing anaerobic styles of training, doing certain types of fartlek or interval training. If I need them to be able to simply be able to have a higher aerobic capacity, then I'm either going to focus on higher volumes of anaerobic training or design into the program where I'm doing once or twice a week some longer endurance aerobic exercise. Or if I want to do and want to make sure I'm doing my strength training and improving overall power and strength development, I need to make sure that I'm making the intensity more prior to that as well. So, but that's outside of aerobic training. So whatever specific adaptations you're trying to create for your students, for your athletes, make sure that you're dictating your workouts or your conditioning work to be at that particular intensity. How do I designate that? So you want to be able to go off of any access that you have. So more often than not many institutions are going to be able to have access for you to be able to figure out the VO2 max of every one of your athletes. It's not feasible. The only places where they're really going to be able to do that are very, very professional fitness facilities such as Exos or other clinical areas such as universities or hospitals. There are not many places you can figure out a VO2 max. And when you work with adapted athletes, it makes it that much more difficult to determine. So we have to use submaximal rates or some form of calculations in order to figure this out. And the easiest way is heart rate, okay? Because we have found that there's a correlation between particular levels of heart rate and your overall heart rate reserve or your VO2 max level. So first way that we do that is using the most clinically sound method that we have now called the Carnovin method. Now, many of you, if you've ever had any type of exercise science related education, know that one of the most rudimentary methods of calculating your target heart rate for exercise was simply done by taking your maximum heart rate and then multiplying it by whatever intensity of exercise that you were gauging to go after. So for instance, 220 minus your age is the classic equation to figure out your max heart rate. Because we know as you continue to age, your maximum heart rate continues to slow down over time. And the best estimated guess equation that we can use for that is 220 minus your age. And then if you were to say wanting to work at a light to moderate intensity, that'd be anywhere from 50 to 75%. If you wanted to work from moderate or higher, 75 to anywhere close to 85, and then higher intensity is anything above 85 or 90% of your heart rate max. And that's typically how you would do very basic calculations of figuring out where someone's heart rate should be for a various intensity of exercise. But from clinical standards, we have found that using our heart rate reserve or Carnovin method is a much more efficient way to give us a clearer picture of where the heart rate needs to be to get the proper amount of adaptation. So what is the minimum effective dose is a better way of saying this. So the Carnovin method allows us to do that. So the way that we discover our heart rate reserve is we will first do 220 minus our age, to which then we subtract our resting heart rate. And so the only way to find our resting heart rate is to calculate it, either by taking your carotid pulse or your radial pulse here on your wrist, where you will count your beats per second, make sure you're at rest for at least 5 minutes before you do so, and you can either count for 15 seconds and multiply by 4, or you can count for the entire 60 seconds. Once you have your resting heart rate, then you can subtract that from the max heart rate, and then you can figure out your target heart rate by taking that heart rate reserve that you just calculated and multiply it by your exercise intensity. So if it's light, moderate, or high intensity, and then you add back in your resting heart rate, and that will give you the calculation. And this just shows you how to do it once again if I were doing an aerobic endurance training program and I was using the percentage of maximal heart rate. If you don't have access to any of those, you go based off of rate of perceived exertion, which has also been found to be very correlated to the overall effort that someone is putting forth during physical activity. So rate of perceived exertion can come in multiple forms. As you see here, this is on the 1 to 10 scale. This is the Omni scale. And the Omni scale is very, very simple, a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being as if you're lying down, no exertion at all, 10 being your absolute maximum effort. There are other scales that have existed in the literature. Other forms have also been found to be the Borg scale of rate of perceived exertion, which differs by being on a rating from 6 to 20. And if you relate that to something that'd be able to see in a visualization, you could say add a 0 to the end of 6 and 20, and that could be applicable to someone's heart rate. So you can use either scale, and you can also kind of combine this with the talk test, which is a very basic rudimentary test that we teach young fitness professionals to use when working with clients. If you're unable to speak when you're doing physical activity, you're probably at a higher, moderate to higher level intensity of physical activity. So use whatever means necessary you need to track how your athletes are performing at a particular time, and make sure that you record these so that you can keep track of them as you're going from week to week throughout your athlete's conditioning program, so that you can make the necessary changes on whether or not you're giving not enough of a stimulus or not enough of the intensity, or if you need to dial things down. How long should my training session be? All right, it's going to be influenced on the following factors. The intensity is going to be the first most important factor when it comes to how long the intensity is. So first you have to determine, okay, what is the overall adaptation I'm going for? Am I trying to build speed and power? Am I trying to improve anaerobic endurance, or am I simply trying to improve aerobic endurance? That's going to influence the overall intensity of exercise. If the intensity is really high, then that's going to improve my overall anaerobic endurance, my strength and power. If the intensity is very, very low, then that's going to enhance my aerobic endurance. Because ultimately, it's going to be how long can I sustain that level of activity? And that's going to determine the overall duration that the exercise needs to be. So typically, and we're going to get into each various type of exercise to show you what types of durations you can expect and how you can implement them into your team's training program. The last step is exercise progression. How are you going to progress? Because remember, the way that our bodies adapt is based off of the principle of progressive overload. I must manipulate particular training variables in order to continue my body's adaptation. Because if you don't continue to overload it in some specific way, your body's no longer going to grow. You're going to get used to the type of training that you're doing, and there's not going to be any incentive or any stimulus that's enough for my body to want to adapt and become stronger, become faster, or build endurance. So this is usually going to come from my changes in frequency, intensity, or duration. Once again, being very, very careful that they do not increase by more than 10% per week. So this means that you have to make sure that you're calculating and keeping track of how many minutes am my athletes working out for? How long is the sprint? How long is the bout? Is it 10 seconds? Is it 30 seconds? Are they sprinting for 10 seconds? Are they taking a minute break? You need to be taking track of all these types of things. When it is not feasible to increase either the amount of workouts or the amount of reps or the duration, that's when you can manipulate intensity. But you must be very, very careful because, as I was saying before, when it comes to overtraining, if you're not careful with the way that you're manipulating intensity, you can inflict harm on the body much quicker than actual changes to frequency and duration of exercise. So this just gives you a little bit of an insight into what the overall intensity, frequency per week, or duration of exercise you'd be looking at based off of the following types of exercises that we're going to go through. This is based off of NSCA coaching standards. So when I talk about LSD, or long distance training, this is going to be my much longer duration, very, very low on the intensity scale. Pace and tempo is very, very specific style of training for aerobic athletes. We'll get into the type of sports there. Interval training can be related to anaerobic work. High intensity interval training is going to be highly anaerobic, and then fartlek training is going to be a combination, and that's going to be able to be used in multiple types of sports as well. So let's start with the beginning with long, slow distance training. This is going to be anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. If I'm working with anaerobic athletes, there really is no place for this. If I were to include any type of long distance training, this could be particularly maybe once per week at the maximum when it comes to my programming for these athletes. Reason being is because if we go backwards and talk about the compatibility of aerobic training and things like resistance training, we know that if we do way too much aerobic training, that's going to have a negative impact on my body to adapt to strength training. And I'm going to make it much harder on my athletes to build strength, to build power, and to build that explosiveness. So that might not be the best bet if I'm trying to improve my aerobic endurance of my athletes. This is going to be much more appropriate for my longer, steady state, cardiovascular-based athletes who are more involved in the long distance types of work. However, there is benefits to doing this types of training, which includes increasing my body's ability to clear lactate, because once again, doing this type of exercise is going to improve my lactate threshold, and it is going to make that shift of type 2 down to type 1 muscle fibers. Once again, that having a negative impact on anaerobic type of athletes. So long steady state exercise is going to have a much, much more benefit if my athletes are very sport specific to that style of training. What about interval or tempo training? So we have to make sure that we accurately define these, because when a lot of people hear the word interval, their mind instantly goes to high intensity interval training, when that's actually not true. Interval and tempo training can be applied to all different types of sports, all different types of modalities. And this one in particular, interval tempo training, applies to what a marathon runner would do in order to get better for an actual marathon or long steady state distance type of work. Because a steady pace tempo training would be anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes at a continuous training to get to the lactate threshold, whereas an intermittent pace is a series of shorter intervals with brief recovery periods. This allows someone like a long distance aerobic athlete to not only improve their overall endurance to be able to push themselves harder for longer, but the intervals would also increase a little bit of their anaerobic capacity to allow them to be able to increase the speed of which they're able to perform at that longer distance rates. Okay, so it's much more applicable to a long distance runner than it would be an anaerobic athlete. So this, once again, is more for our aerobic types of sports, but it still can be useful in case there needs to be a different modality of training. Because once again, there are also different seasons of the year for our athletes where particular types of training could potentially be beneficial. And certain periods like the off season could be a potential area for that, for a particular anaerobic need to improve their overall aerobic capacity. Now we're starting to get more into our anaerobic area now. Now we're getting directly into interval training itself, not high intensity interval training, simply interval training, where my intensity is going to be a little bit closer to my VO2 max. So this is going to be anywhere from probably anywhere from 85 to 90% of my heart rate max, okay? I have intervals of 3 to 5 minutes. So this is where I'd be pushing myself close to as hard as I can, anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes bouts, all right? And I could use a track, I could use whatever setting I'm in for any type of athlete, adapted or non-adapted, where I would work for 3 to 5 minutes, and then I would take 3 to 5 minutes of rest. Because if I'm pushing myself that hard in aerobic training, I want to make sure I give my body enough time to recover that specific energy system. Because if I were to reduce those rest ratios way too low in comparison to the amount of time I was taking to really push myself, I would not be able to get the same amount of effort in each subsequent bout. And thus it would decrease the efficiency of doing the training in the first place. So if you are choosing interval training with your athletes, be very, very careful that when you do interval training, that you literally take as much time as the bout lasts. That's exactly how much rest you take as well. So if you're going to do 3-minute all out, all right, or 3-minute higher intensity bouts of whatever type of training you're doing, make sure you're also resting for 3 to 5 minutes at a much lower speed. Not only will you be able to perform better each rep or each bout, you'll get much more out of the training, and the adaptations will be much more easier to incur. Doing interval training is very, very beneficial for your VO2 max and also enhances your anaerobic metabolism. So it allows you to not only have increased efficiency in using carbohydrates for energy, but it also gives you the better ability of actually being able to push yourself harder for longer within that energy system, and will even improve the onset of your blood lactate within your blood. Interval training such as this would be very, very good for an anaerobic style athlete. And then we get into the real hit, all right? High intensity interval training, okay? This is the actual hit now. And unfortunately, many individuals in the fitness industry get hit wrong, because if you're doing true high intensity interval training, you need to be 90% or higher above your VO2 max during the entire rep. Many fitness or group exercise classes that claim to be hit claim to achieve this, but they don't. They're doing really moderate interval training. They're not doing high intensity interval training. To really incur the impact of high intensity interval training, you really, really need to be pushing yourself. Okay. If you were to put this on the clinical level, if you've ever seen these really, really difficult power output tests that we use with Monarch ergometers, which literally push athletes to their absolute limit. Most oftentimes, if you're doing really high intense interval training and you're out of shape, you should either be passed out or darn near throwing up. That's how hard high intensity training really is. Okay, it's very, very difficult style of training. So before you use high intensity training with any athlete, it is very, very important that they have a base level of aerobic capacity first. So this is why I went in order from LSD to tempo to interval now to real hit. Is if you're starting at the beginning of the season and you go right into hit, you have the potential of not only causing harm, but also pushing your athletes into overtraining really, really, really quickly. You have to make sure that you build up a base before you move on to real high intensity interval training, because it has that much of a drastic impact on the body. This is where normal interval training would be much more appropriate until your athletes build up a higher level of aerobic capacity to be able to handle something like actual real high intensity interval training. high intensity interval training is more important for developing speed than it is for actual aerobic capacity. But it can be beneficial for those quick bouts and those explosive bursts that you need to take a hold of in various anaerobic sports, such as football or basketball. So an example of a HIIT routine would be anywhere from your interval being anywhere from less than or equal to 2 minutes or lower, and then your relief bouts being just as equal. So once again, very, very similar to what it would be for interval training, but they're usually much, much smaller. And then the final one is fartlek training, which includes a various variety of all sorts. And you can use fartlek training for a variety of different sports, anaerobic or aerobic. And it's usually most often used for cyclists and swimming, but it's been seen to be used in other places as well, such as anywhere from football or basketball athletes, where you will combine things like easy running, and then you do hill work, where you do all out of 85 to 90% of your VO2 max. And there's been a lot of benefits seen with fartlek training. You can compare fartlek training very much so to interval style training as well. It's very, very similar, just less rigid in its actual programming, but has been found to have benefits in both enhancing your VO2 max, increasing your lactate threshold, and improving your overall fuel and running economy. So the overall take-home point to take here is that if I'm working with an athlete, I need to take a overall approach. Not only do I need to take a look at what my athlete needs specifically for that sport, but also to make sure that I include various forms of training to maximize those adaptations according to their specific training status and the time of season that they're in. Because depending on the time of season, there might be different needs or might need to be a different focus point on whatever type of adaptation they need to improve on for the next season. So for instance, if I have a team that is really strong, but really slow, then that'll give me an indication, or let's say that they fatigue really fast, that might give me an indication that during the off season, I might need to focus more on maintaining strength, but really focusing on aerobic activity in order to increase my aerobic capacity. So I need to be really, really cognitively aware of what are the needs of my athletes and at what time of year, or what time of the seasons that I'm currently participating in. Okay, so if we were to take a generalized approach on what most teams would be using during this time, when it comes to the off season, this is a very base level of training. Most teams would employ doing high aerobic capacity work of long duration here, and then gradually improve it over time. That way they have a great level of aerobic capacity. They have that base that they need before they get into the preseason, where they start to do more activities that are going to be related to the actual performance of what they're going to be doing on the field. When I get into preseason, this is where it's going to be more impactful to do more power development, more increased intensity, doing my best to maintain that aerobic capacity, but incorporating many other styles of training, including speed work, agility, and also enhancing in strength. During the season itself is when I need to be really consciously aware of how much I'm doing, because if I do way too much during the season, it's going to definitely impact my ability to recover, my ability to perform on the field where it's really going to count. So this is where I'm going to do my best to maintain strength, doing low volumes of strength training work, and also maintain my aerobic or anaerobic endurance by keeping intensity lower or keeping training to short duration during practices. You would never want to go way high on the volume levels of activity during the actual year of the sport. And then during postseason or the active rest, you really do want to make sure that you're taking time away from the competitive season and making sure that you're getting some level of recreational recovery, because they have found through consistent research that when an athlete or a normal individual who engages in physical activity is continually doing work month in and month out, we almost get to this point every 3 or 4 weeks, 3 or 4 months, where your body needs a little bit of an extended time off, a little extended period of time where we at least taper back the total amount of work that we're doing to allow our bodies to fully recover, to allow our endocrine systems, our hormones to get back to normal levels, so that our body will be ready to train again. Because you can get to a point that if you do not do this, your body can continually push higher and higher into fatigue level zones and once again be pushed into overtraining. So let's talk about the difference between detraining and tapering itself. Detraining is very different from tapering, okay? Detraining is the actual cessation in training. It's when I either completely stop training as a result of the season ending, an injury, sickness, so on and so forth. And this actually equals a loss of adaptation. We want to help stray away from this. We want to prevent detraining from happening, because we would lose all of the great progressions that we've made throughout time. And we have seen that you lose cardiovascular adaptations or aerobic adaptations within 1 to 2 weeks of not doing any cardiovascular training. That is very, very quickly. So we need to make sure that we're doing some form of training in some way to be able to at least keep the adaptations that we have or that we've gained, while at the same time allowing our athletes to recover properly. Same thing happens in strength training. It's very difficult to lose muscle mass fast unless you're very, very sick, but you do lose strength adaptations very quickly as well within 1 to 2 weeks of detraining. So what do? We taper. Okay, taper is a systematic reduction in training that allows for peak performance. You can also relate this to how we use what's called a deload period, where we continue to train, but we significantly drop the volume of work that we're doing. So I'll put this as an illustration for strength training first. So if I'm doing strength training work and my body is used to doing 4 to 5 times per week of 3 to 4 sets of 8 to 12 total exercises, and I'm getting to my breaking point, my coach would then, to allow me to fully recover for the next phase of training, would take the volume in half completely. He would take the 8 to 12 exercises down to 3 or 4, and would cut the total amount of sets from 3 to 4 sets down to 1 or 2 sets. But at the cost of that, he or she would keep the intensity higher. I would still lift as heavy as I have been, but just reducing the total amount of volume. This would decrease the overall amount of work that my body is doing. That would allow my body to recover much more efficiently. But because I've maintained the higher level of intensity, my body still has to fire on those particular cylinders with neurological adaptation through the motor unit recruitment, the amount of muscle mass that I'm using, and so on and so forth. I'm more likely to hold on to those neurological adaptations. I still stimulate them enough to tell the body, trick the body, if you will, to saying, hey, we still are dealing with the higher intensity stuff. There's still a potential threat. We need to keep those adaptations. Same thing with aerobic or anaerobic training. Keep the intensity, but really, really lower the total amount, the overall volume of work. Instead of doing 10 sets of fartleks or 10 sets of intervals, reduce it down to 4 sets of intervals, or maybe down from an hour of fartlek training down to 20 minutes of fartlek training. That decrease in volume would allow my body to recover, but the intensity is still high enough where I still have to maintain those adaptations on a physiological level. And thus, when it's either ready for the next phase of training or for the actual competition, whether it's a basketball tournament, whether it's a wrestling match, whether it's a football game or a track meet, whatever it is, I'll be able to perform at my absolute best, because that recovery that occurred then would allow my body to go through what's called supercompensation, which is where I recover, I become stronger, I have a higher level of endurance, I can push myself harder for longer. So tapering can be used in a very powerful way to not only help my athletes recover, but improve their performance when it comes to game time. And lastly here, we look at resistance training aerobics together. When it comes to my aerobic athletes, resistance training is very good for my aerobic athletes. Whereas when I have long steady state individuals or longer endurance athletes, and they include strength training once or twice a week, they can actually see improvement in some of their anaerobic capacity. They seem to have faster recovery from their injuries, and it prevents their muscle overuse injuries, because aerobic athletes go hard. They can put a lot of wear and tear. They put a lot of time and a lot of overuse into the same body mechanics. Runners in particular, when they do strength training, they become more resilient towards a lot of these overuse injuries, and it reduces their overall imbalances that might occur from their technique flaws or their loss in their proper gait cycle due to fatigue over time. So just to wrap things up, when it comes to enhancing conditioning or overall aerobic and anaerobic endurance for your athletes, we must be able to keep in mind all the adaptations that happen under the hood. We need to keep in mind the training status and the overall needs of my overall athlete, what specific type of sport that they're working for, making sure that I'm paying attention to having a program that focuses on the frequency, the overall volume and intensity that I'm doing. What are the specific needs? What types of modes of training do I really need to do for my types of athletes, whether they're adapted or non-adapted athletes? And am I making sure that I'm keeping apprised of their recovery? And are they getting what they need to be able to continue to perform? If there's any questions, I'm here to take them. And as always, thank you for coming to our hashtag Adapt to Home series with Ability 360 and Move You United. We thank you for your time. Stay healthy, stay safe, and continue to do your best out there. I'm Coach P. We're out of here.